Hello and welcome to this online lesson. My name is Mr. Hoven. And if you remember from the last video we were together on, we talked about the New England, the Middle, and the Southern colonies. And the Southern colonies, we're going to spend a little bit more looking at their way of life today, especially in terms of Africans in slavery. Remember, the economy was based in the Southern colonies on farming and agriculture, the farming of cotton, the farming of tobacco, and the farming of rice. That was their big cash crops, what they made money with. And in order for these plantations to exist, you needed people to work on the plantations. So that's where these colonists began to turn to Africans and slave labor. Let's go ahead and get started. So in this new world, not all Africans were actually slaves. And in fact, by 1619, 15 black men and 17 black women were already living in the colony of Virginia. But that same year, a Dutch ship arrived with about 20 Africans and sold these Africans to Virginians who needed laborers to grow tobacco. The colonists valued the agricultural skills the Africans brought with them. And by 1644, about 300 Africans were living in Virginia. Now, not all were slaves. Some worked as servants and expected to one day own their own farms. Some even became free planters. One individual, he had 250 acres of his own and employed 5 servants to help him work. And for a time, free Africans in Virginia also had the right to vote, so they were able to vote. But later on, in the 1600s, that began to change. Virginia's government set up a system of laws to begin enslaving Africans. So growth of slavery and the slave trade. In the early years, Americans in the English colonies included free people and the servants as well as slaves. Even some Africans were free. They were not slaves. However, in 1619, the first slaves were brought to Virginia, and this began the trend. For the next 50 years, the status of Africans in Virginia was very unclear. Because the African population was so small, they really weren't sure where they fell into the populations of the New World. Some were slaves, some became servants, some Africans tried to purchase their freedom, others tried to escape and become successful property owners in the North. But slavery eventually made up the majority populations in South Carolina and Georgia. The reason being was because plantations in these southern colonies had become to rely on slave labor. Slaves worked the land and tended the livestock. Now, slavery really was going on in Africa well before the Europeans began bringing slaves over to the New World. In order to maintain the supply of slaves they needed, southern planters relied on a system of slave trade that stretched halfway across the globe. In Africa, slavery had been a part of the social and economic system since ancient times. Often during wars, if you captured captives, they became slaves and were forced to work as servants. However, these individuals were not treated as lower. They were still treated as human beings. They were just used as servants. As the demand for slaves increased in the south of the new colonies, raids were conducted by slave traders who would go into African villages in the picture you see here, capture a bunch of Africans, men, women, and children, no one was spared, and put them on ships to send them over to America. They would cross what would become known as the Middle Passage. In the Middle Passage, in the 1700s, English sailors began referring to this passage of slave ships that went west across the Atlantic as the Middle Passage. On these ships where the slaves were herded onto, slaves were crammed together in tight shelves, and you can see pictures here on the slide. They were allowed on deck to eat and exercise once or twice a day. Few were able to escape. Some would stage a mutiny to revolt against the crew. So mutiny has come up a few times. And the idea of that is someone that tries to stage a revolt and overthrow either a government, a leader, or someone in control of you. About 10% of the Africans died during the voyage through the Middle Passage. Slaves died from disease that was spread in filthy, crowded, cramped, warm, hot conditions. And the slave trade through the Middle Passage caused the deaths of 2 to 3 million Africans. That's an estimate, but that's saying that the ships on the journey from Europe or Africa to the New World, on average, throughout 400 years or so, that's 2 to 3 million people died on just the journey over. So now that these slaves are over in the New World, there was a huge emphasis on limiting their rights. As the importance of slavery increased, greater limits were placed on the rights of slaves. Colonists passed laws that set out rules for slaves' behavior and denied slaves their basic human rights. They were treated more like property than humans. These quote unquote slave codes treated enslaved Africans not as human beings, as I said, but as property. Most English colonists did not question the justice of owning slaves. They believed black Africans were inferior to white Europeans. The belief that one race is superior to another is known as racism. So these racist ideas really fueled why no one spoke up. Some colonists believed that they were helping the slaves by introducing them to Christianity. There were, however, a handful of colonists that spoke out against the evils of slavery. And the first group in 1688 were Quakers from Germantown, Pennsylvania. And they were the first ones to kind of call for an end to slavery and start that abolitionist movement. So, the Africans being brought over to the New World were all part of a system known as triangular trade. The colonies produced a wide variety of goods, and merchant ships sailed up and down the Atlantic coast. Several trade routes were developed by colonial merchants. This one route was known as the triangular trade because of the three legs of the route formed a triangle, as you can see here. So on the first leg, ships from New England carried fish and other goods to the West Indies. Once that happened, the second leg brought rum, guns, gunpowder, and tools from New England to West Africa. The third leg carried enslaved Africans to the West Indies. So you can kind of see that system over on the picture on this slide. But that's what really fueled this kind of taking Africans away from their homeland and turning them into slaves. Racist ideas, the need for work in the southern colonies because agriculture was a really big deal. I hope you enjoyed this online lesson, and we'll see you next time.